OPB Podcasts.
From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Wednesday, March 11th. The 2026 short legislative session is over. In just over a month, lawmakers passed so many bills it was nearly impossible to keep track of it all. They moved a gas tax vote to the May election. They spent big to keep the Trailblazers in Portland. They filled state budget holes and even bought a waterfall. If you missed the action, we're here to bring you up to speed. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Bryce Dole.
I'm OPB Politics reporter Lauren Dake.
And I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk, VanderHart.
And if you're listening, we also plan to answer some reader questions later in the show. But for now, Dirk, Lauren, always a pleasure to see you both. How are you?
Oh, so good to be back in the Gert Boyle studio.
Yes, nice to see you,
Trying
Bryce.
session. We're back.
Okay. I feel like we blinked and the short session was over. How do you guys feel?
You blinked?
Yep.
You mean you fell asleep into a deep restorative nap?
Something like that.
It was a blur, but it felt a little longer than a blink to me.
Okay. How'd you feel?
I mean, look, I was going into this session telling everyone 5 weeks, I can do this. I'm looking forward to this. This is going to be fun. It was not fun. I'm just going to say that. It felt kind of brutal, frankly.
Why?
We could get into it. I mean, there just felt like there was so many things to keep track of. There's always never-ending committee hearings, but it felt like every day at 8 a.m. there was a committee hearing I needed to watch and needed to listen to. And every day when I was driving home, I needed to listen to something. And it was just nonstop, never-ending legislative brutality.
And hard to keep track of it all.
Like the end of session where there's always this point of the session where it's called the hurry up and wait, where you're just rushing to make it because you think your bill is going to be up and then it's not up and you wait and you wait and wait. And it felt extra so this session. So many bills. And there was one entire floor session that they didn't post to OLS. They didn't post to the legislative website until the day and a half later because of technical difficulties. So I just feel like the hurry up and wait was extra intense.
See, that was not my issue though, because even as we were waiting, you were waiting for some ICE bills that I'm sure we'll talk about. But like there was just a bunch of other bills that it was like, should we be covering this? Do I have the time to cover this? This feels kind of important. Anyway.
And they would just come up kind of suddenly. Like I remember I was sitting on the House floor at one point and they started to debate the campaign finance bill, which I don't think had been scheduled like at that point. It just was suddenly right in front of me. And I was
they
supposed
just
to cover it.
Don't announce things.
Right.
They don't give any notice. And here you go. So you better be on your toes.
Right. So let's take our listeners back to the end of the session for a moment. Lawmakers adjourned late Friday afternoon. They opened the doors of both chambers, and lawmakers, they all walked out and met in the middle in the newly renovated rotunda for the first time since it's been renovated. They were chatting and taking pictures and hugging, and it all just felt to me kind of happy, which feels unusual for politics these days. I do want to play some tape from House Speaker Julie Fahey. This comes from a news conference shortly after lawmakers adjourned.
We laid out an agenda for this short session that was, to put it mildly, very ambitious, particularly for a short session. And today I'm pleased to say that I think we accomplished everything we set out to do and more.
Lauren, what surprised you about this session and how it wrapped up?
I did not have them buying a waterfall on my bingo card. That was surprising. They bought a 92-foot waterfall east of Salem, so they preserved that for public use.
It's a funny way to put it. I mean, they bought the land surrounding this waterfall. I love that framing, but there was land surrounding the waterfall. It wasn't just...
Right. But it included the waterfall. Yes. And I like that framing too, so I'm going to use it. Thanks. And, I think we were just getting into this, but they packed a lot into the last 5 weeks. And I think they largely did so without a ton of political drama. We'll get into this, but there were some boycotts of some floor sessions. I wouldn't call them walkouts, but Republicans basically just skipped a few floor sessions. So largely the legislative antics were kept to a minimum. Even some of the ICE bills that I thought were going to really prompt like pretty heated debate didn't always. When one of the bills hit the Senate floor, there was actually no debate. It was the bill to prohibit ICE agents from wearing masks. And Republicans did weigh in, but very minimally. One senator stood up, Senator Fred Gerard, and just said, I'm kind of sick of these I hate police bills, and sat back down. And that was his debate. Mm-hmm. So
you're expecting more.
Yeah. And I think being back in the building also really changed the tone, as you said. I think that that gave it a different energy that I wasn't really, I probably didn't really think about before, but I wasn't really prepared for how much better that would feel to be back there.
Well, we were back. Lawmakers had been in the building, right? But most of the building was closed. And so now we had this, I think they have a lounge that they were in together for the first time. It was just like the full Capitol was available to us. You mentioned that pageantry on the last day where they all sort of stroll down the Capitol, the steps on their respective sides and like embrace or whatever they're going to do in the middle. It was nice. I think we kept saying that word on Sine Die Day. Nice. It was nice.
Dirk, Speaker Fahey called this session ambitious.
Yeah.
How ambitious was it compared to other short sessions that you've covered?
I think it was up there. I think the high watermark for me for an ambitious short session was 2 years ago, 2024. That was the year that lawmakers passed campaign contribution limits, which no one thought was possible. It was the year they recriminalized drug possessions, essentially rolling back a huge part of Measure 110, another very, very big, weighty process. So that was an ambitious session. I think they did a lot this time. There were two basically big budget holes they had to grapple with. There were the trailblazers to appease. There was still a lot of squabbling to be done about when we would vote on a gas tax and transportation fee increase that they passed last year. A lot of squabbling to be done. And there was some immigration and ICE pushback that Lauren has mentioned. In any, I said this earlier, in any session, there are marquee issues that get a lot of attention, and there are a lot of lesser issues that maybe you do a story about and kind of track. For me, there was just a lot of like middle ground issues this time where it was like I wasn't going to spend every waking hour tracking the bills, but you couldn't ignore them. They were up. You had to be tracking them, and it took up a lot of mental space. I think that was part of what I was talking about, this being just a very energy-intensive session.
And each of us were in the Capitol until Friday evening as party leaders came out one group at a time to talk to the press about what they got done this session. What did you guys hear from them about how they were framing the session overall? Like, Dirk, what did you hear?
Yeah. Look, Democrats have majorities. They have super majorities. They're never going to come to you at the end of session and say, well, that didn't go like, sometimes they will, but like usually they're going to say, we delivered for Oregonians. There's an election this year. We made things more affordable. We championed the working families that are so important to our lifeblood. That is a lot of what you hear on the Sine Die. And, I think they said that this time. You heard some of what Fahey's takeaway was. GOP can be variable, I think, in Sine Die. Like sometimes they come and they're really mad. Like there's been some gun bills shoved through at the end of session or a bunch of things that they say are very unpalatable. This time it was not that. It was far more measured. You heard, the Senate Republican leader Bruce Starr saying, well, as always, Democrats are expanding government. That they are saying that Democrats raised taxes and probably weren't doing things that were great for affordability in the Republicans' mind. But they also clearly got some things they liked. There was, money for wolf depredation, money for state fairs, this big farm store bill that Republicans liked, this bill that saved this hospital in Coos Bay or at least potentially rescued it from foreclosure. So anyway, they got some things they liked. They killed some stuff. I don't think there was a very heated response to the session from Republicans. They seemed somewhat satisfied with the outcome.
Yeah. Lauren, what were your takeaways about just how party leaders were characterizing the session at the end?
Well, yeah, I agree with Dirk. Like, they were very familiar. I've also never heard Democrats come out and be like, well, we failed. Even after even after the transportation package passed that one session, they still framed it as like, we're innovating here, and innovation takes time.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
But from the very beginning of this session, Democrats made it really clear that their North Star was going to be pushing back on the federal government, and particularly when it comes to the federal government's mass deportation efforts. And they did that. They passed a lot of bills aimed at, reining in ICE. The most high-profile one that we just talked about was prohibiting ICE agents from wearing masks. They passed that through. The governor's expected to sign it, and then it will probably be challenged in the courts. But that's something that was a big deal to them. They also passed other measures to ensure schools and hospitals and other public spaces have clear policies around what to do if ICE agents show up. They tried to make it harder for a person to get detained while they're seeking medical care. That's something that we saw here in the state just a few months ago when some parents took their 7-year-old child to go to the doctors to seek medical care because her nose bleeds when it stopped, and the whole family was detained. So that's a big deal. They tried to make it easier to sue federal officers if they enter a person's house without a warrant or without properly identifying themselves. So they passed a lot of bills. Most of them or all of them are expected to be signed by the governor, and then from there we'll probably see some court challenges.
Yeah, this might be kind of a blunt way to ask this question, but do lawmakers actually think that these bills will make a meaningful difference when it comes to responding to ICE? I mean, do we really expect to suddenly see ICE and the Trump administration comply with a whole bunch of new rules passed by by Democratic leaders here?
I mean, that is a question, right? But they can't not try. So I think that they're genuinely hoping that it moves the state in the right direction. I mean, we saw in California, California lawmakers passed a similar bill prohibiting ICE agents from wearing masks. The governor signed that. It was promptly challenged in courts. And then the court ruling seemed to sort of suggest that there would be a better chance of court approval if that anti-masking bill applied to all levels of law enforcement, so not just federal agents, but state and local. And so Oregon lawmakers, took that into consideration when they were writing their legislation. So there's been some, they're taking ideas from other places with the hopes that it will pass muster. But I think there is also the reality that, this is going to be an ongoing issue. Here is what House Democratic leader Ben Bowman said on Sine Die.
I think the work that we did this session has positioned Oregon as a national leader on standing up for our immigrant communities. And what I will say is a little bit unsatisfying about that is we also know that the federal government still has the capacity to do really horrific things to the people who live in this state. We're going to have to continue to monitor what is happening in Oregon with the federal government so that we can protect Oregonians who are being unfairly victimized by the federal government.
So I don't think anyone thinks, okay, we passed this bill and now all ICE agents are going to, stop concealing their identities. It's something that's going to continue to play out and something we'll all continue to watch.
Okay. Let's dig into some of the other top issues, starting with the Trailblazers. This was a big one. Governor Kotek at the press conference on Friday night was even wearing a Blazers pin. Dirk, what does it mean that this bill passed?
Well, I mean, let's be honest. A lot of people were wearing those pins. I was in I was in the Capitol when the big Rip City sign was in, and Blaze the Trail Cat was in the building, and some Blazers dancers, and Terry Porter was there. This was a really, really hard push by the Trailblazers this session. They were basically making the case to legislative leaders, look, if you don't give us a bunch of money to revamp the Moda Center, bring it into the modern age, make it suitable for a modern NBA team, there is a very good chance that this team walks away once a new owner, Tom Dundon, takes over. It was a pretty hard threat, and I have to say it was very successful. I mean, all the top Democrats, many of the top Republicans, clearly had come to the conclusion that this was too big a risk to take, that, the Moda Center is owned by Portland. It's technically a public asset, and that this is Oregon's arena, that it's up to Oregonians to pay for. And so they passed this bill, 1501, I think, or 1599. Anyway, whatever it was, what it does is essentially it siphons off income taxes that the Blazers pay, but also people who perform in the Rose Quarter pay, and any construction company that does work on the Moda Center would pay into. And it will use that money, about $72 million next budget, we're told, but going forward, to pay off bonds, $265 million that we will be borrowing to help fund these renovations to the Moda Center that theoretically are going to start next year. But in exchange for that, we need a couple of things, lawmakers say. We need the Blazers to agree to a long-term lease, 20 years in the building. We need the city of Portland and Multnomah County to chip in some money. I think they've talked about $200 million or so, or even more. And we need the Blazers to agree that if there are cost overages on whatever the project looks like, they are going to pay. That is the only suggestion that Tom Dundon or the Trailblazers organization is going to have any exposure to this actual project. So that's how it looked. I have to say the politics on this got interesting because Democrats were broadly in favor. People agreed that this was an important bill to save Portland, or at least, help Portland avoid sliding into some worse fate. But Republicans are saying, look, all I've heard from you guys for the last however long is that billionaires suck. They need to pay more of their fair share. And now you're saying we need to give 365 million. I think I missed that. 365 million to this billionaire who just bought the team for $4 billion. They are not the only ones that are critical of this deal. A lot of people are looking at it and trying to figure out whether we're getting a good deal, but it has moved forward.
Okay. Another way lawmakers were looking to respond to the Trump administration this year was in the state budget. Oregon was facing a nearly $750 million funding gap, if I remember correctly, largely because of reduced revenue due to tax changes through the One Big Beautiful Bill. Oregon was also facing more than $300 million funding hole for the Oregon Department of Transportation.
Yeah.
Dirk, how did lawmakers manage to fill these gaps?
Yeah, it was a combination of, I would say, luck and political will, right? So on the luck side, you're right. We started with a $750 million hole. There was a revenue forecast that lopped $100 million off of that. The revenue was coming in more than expected, we assumed. Then there were some costs that weren't as high as predicted, so that eliminated some money. And then for the political will, they passed a bill that essentially brought back about $300 million more into the state's coffers. We talked about it a lot in the podcast. It sort of blocked these three tax breaks that the Trump administration passed last year from having an impact on the state's income tax code. That's this business benefit for bonus depreciation, car loan interest, some stock earnings for private companies. But that was a very tough balancing act. I mean, Republicans really and businesses really thought that was a bad deal for folks and effectively a tax increase. Democrats say, though, it was absolutely necessary to balance this budget. And in the end, we only had to make about $128 million in trims. The legislature was able to do that by holding positions vacant, by trimming agencies' supply budgets, by funding shifts. A lot of accounting techniques are used. So that was one, and that was actually the easy part. There was also a transportation budget hole because these gas tax and fee increases passed last year got blocked. We didn't have that money, so lawmakers were looking for around $300 million. That was harder. They were able to take some vacancies. They were able to use some federal money to fill in about half the hole, but then they had to make some tough choices, and they ended up moving money away from programs that do a bunch of things like make streets safer for pedestrians and bicycles, that help vehicle electrification, upgrade bridges to withstand earthquakes, improve rail. I mean, a lot of things that there are a lot of constituencies that feel very, very passionate about, and we're very, very upset to see Democrats and Republicans moving money away from these things. And that is probably one of the reasons why, in my opinion, and we might get some pushback on this, I think the legislature kind of hit the ball on this. They had an agreement early in the session on how they were going to make this fill this transportation hole, and they did not reveal how they were going to do that until I think the last week or so, because I think my take on it is they wanted to limit the exposure. If they had released this midway through session, there's more weeks for interest groups to sort of pile on and say this is cataclysmic. You kind of drop it with the budget bills, and it's a little easier to withstand that.
I see. How did Democratic leaders seem to frame? Do they think that that's sustainable?
No, yeah, and we heard them say this on Sunny Day. I mean, there has been a debate about Republicans would say we didn't need the tax increases. We can just shift existing money toward the things we really need to pay for in transportation.
Right, they've been saying that for a long time.
And they've been saying, look, we were proven right here. Look, you just balanced the transportation budget. What Democrats would say, and what we heard Kate Lieber, the budget chair, say, one of the budget chairs, is that, no, this is not a sustainably balanced budget. We are going to feel pain. You are going to have far worse services because of what we had to do. And by the way, the things we moved funding away for, we believe were important. So they don't think this is good. This is a great approach. They say it's something we can deal with in the short term. And remember, like Governor Kotek has promised, if she's reelected, she is going to lead another funding conversation for raising transportation money next year.
So clearly this issue, again, is not going away anytime soon.
I wish it would.
Let's stick with ODOT for one more second, and let's talk about what might be the most politically charged bill of this session, which was the vote to move the gas tax.
Yes.
Dirk, you were already back in Salem yesterday. Right? Covering court proceedings on this issue.
Yep.
So clearly, again, it's not going away anytime soon. Where did we land?
Yeah. I mean, I've been refreshing a court filing all morning to see when a judge is going to rule on this. So, like you said, they passed this gas tax increase and fee increase last year. Republicans helped lead a campaign to force it to the ballot. It was in November, and then this huge fight in this session was whether we should move the vote from November to the May primary election. Democrats say we need certainty sooner. Republicans say, no, you're just cynically trying to move a very unpopular gas tax increase away from this high-stakes election where you're trying to reelect your Democratic governor. This is all politics. So, there was a huge debate, a lot of fights. Democrats passed that. Now we are in a stage where, you're right, there is a court challenge. And the arguments are pretty simple on both sides. The state is saying, and basically the Democratic side is saying, look, the state's constitution gives the legislature explicit power to set the date of ballot measures and referendum. That is what they did here. They moved it from November to May. The people who are challenging this say, sure, the Constitution says that, but that power has limits. And in effect, what you're doing here is making a very chaotic situation where we're not very far away from the May election. Actually, the timelines here are going to hamper people's ability to submit statements for the voters pamphlet, and you're really harming people, and maybe particularly low-income people, because it gets technical, but submitting a statement to the voters pamphlet costs $1,200 unless you get 500 signatures. And they're saying, well, the people that could do it for free now don't have time to do it for free because they can't collect the signatures. In any case, we are waiting from a Marion County judge to see if he's going to block this or not. And regardless of what happens there, I think we will see an appeal to a higher court.
And that ruling is expected this week, right?
Today. I mean, literally,
today.
I'm
Wow.
like looking at my computer right now, waiting to see when it lands.
Okay. So clearly, again, a number of issues that remain unresolved, just like that one. One of them that I'm really interested in that I was tracking was House Bill 4018. This bill has to do with campaign finance, and it passed through both chambers last week. The goal of this bill, just to recap, was to cap political spending as lawmakers had promised by next year, and to make sure that the campaign finance law that was passed 2 years ago, right, could become a reality for the state. The Oregon Secretary of State has been saying over and over again that the previous version of this law was flawed and that the state just needed more time, more money, or else Oregon was potentially going to be at risk of botching the rollout of this law, which Oregon obviously has a history of botching rollouts like this. You have CARE Oregon.
Proud history.
Right? So it's clearly something on state leaders' minds. But campaign finance reform advocates immediately cried foul because, they were saying, hey, we were boxed out of the process for crafting this bill. It was crafted largely by the biggest political spenders, those union groups and business groups and unions that line up on both sides. Yeah. And they basically said that the bill, even though it comes with all these technical changes, it included so many loopholes that they're worried it will just open the door for big political spending that has been, a marked thing in Oregon elections for years, that they'll keep flooding Oregon elections with money. But obviously the bill's supporters, they dispute that.
Yeah, and it didn't really have much trouble passing either chamber, even though we saw a little hand-wringing. I mean, what were some of the things we heard from lawmakers when they supported it?
I mean, what I found really interesting was that you saw more than a few of them openly saying, we do not like this bill. We don't think it's going to be the final version of it. It needs work. It's flawed. It's too complicated. And they even kind of said that they were reluctant to vote for it. They felt like they were stuck between a rock and a hard place. I think Senator Liebers at one point said like a rock and a rock, because the worst case scenario is that they don't pass a bill, also in their view, and Oregon botches the rollout apparently. So I'll give you an example. Here's Senator Lou Frederick talking about this bill on the Senate floor before he voted for it.
I recognize that the new system we have set up will continue to be far too complicated for many, even with House Bill 4018, but the alternative of doing nothing is much worse. That is not a position I want to be in. but it is the reality of where we are.
So lawmakers promised to keep working on this bill this law next session, and they even passed a bill requiring the Secretary of State to come back with new recommendations. But again, it does set those contribution limits in place for next year's election.
It keeps them in place.
Oh, keeps them in place. Right. Thank you. Yep. Okay, let's take a quick break. Then we'll come back and talk more about the session. There were dozens of other bills that passed, and so let's touch on a few of them. Lauren, what do you got?
One bill I covered this session was the governor's sort of marquee housing bill for the session. Mm-hmm. And that would allow cities to bypass the state's land use laws if they're going to build housing for people 55 or older or for manufactured parks. So basically, cities with a population of 25,000 or more get to bring in 100 acres. Those with smaller populations get to bring in 50 acres. The bill expires in 2033. And the reason the governor is doing this, as Bryce, you know, because you did a nice story all about it, was that, the number of Oregonians who are 55 and older without housing is growing. Right. I think we have 1 in 4 Oregonians who are homeless that were older than 55, and so we're higher than the national average.
Right.
So that was, a big deal, and will be interesting to see how that one plays out. Another bill that I think is just worth pointing out is it's called the Foster Care Bill of Rights bill, and it's a bill that's existed before. This is sort of like an evolution of this bill. But one thing this latest iteration does is make sure that kids who are in the system, some 4,500 kids in the state's child welfare system, are able to see their biological siblings. Like, that's a big deal for them when they're ripped out from their house. They're put in hotels or residential facilities or bounce around from one foster home to the next. They lose contact with, some of their family that they've had. So this bill ensures that they have the right to contact those siblings, are alerted if a new sibling is born. It also gives them a right to attend their own court hearings. It's something that you would think that they maybe already have.
Right.
They sort of did, but it was qualified. There was a lot of, they get a go if the state's Department of Human Services deems that it's appropriate, or they get a go if their current foster home deems it's appropriate. Now they get to go. The only way that it's restricted is if the court weighs in. Mm-hmm. So it really strengthens it for them.
I see. Dirk, what were some other bills that passed this session that you thought were notable?
One of the things I was looking at was economic development, right? We saw in December, the governor comes out. She says, look, I acknowledge that this state has a spotty economic record right now. We've tanked in some of these national metrics that try to rate how business-friendly folks are. And I'm going to make it, I think she said she wants to get us into the top 10 of the CNBC rankings. I don't know if there's a timeline on that. But anyway, she's created this Prosperity Council, and she brought a bill forward this session. This was House Bill 4084. It does a couple things. The big thing is it creates this way to speed up permitting for large developments around the state. There's an acknowledgement that permitting is kind of tough, maybe too tough in Oregon. Let's, at least when there's some very big developments at play, make sure that folks can get this done pretty quickly. But the bill ran into trouble and a lot of criticism, I would say, because another thing it did was expand this property tax break program, enterprise zones, again, trying to seed the ground for business activity. But critics came in and said, look, enterprise zones are used a lot by data centers, which are super resource intensive, use a ton of power, don't necessarily create a bunch of jobs. We don't think they're the highest use of economic development dollars. And so she got a lot of pushback there. She eventually included a carve out so data centers can't get these benefits for, I think, a year. But, that was sort of the big economic development bill of the session. There was also the Moda Center thing we talked about, which Dems would say, huge for helping Portland. They expanded this tax credit for low-income folks, which was their big affordability push. But I think that business groups, right, and Republicans who are always going to kind of naysay and are always going to want more, let's be honest, did look at this and say, I don't know that this is a net gain in terms of economic development. They were really mad about some of the disconnections from the Trump tax breaks that, depending on how you looked at it, they would say increased businesses' taxes in the short term from what they would be paying hundreds of millions of dollars. They would say, yeah, that would have been more fruitful for business in the state than the things you're doing. Another thing we tracked that didn't pass was the estate tax reforms, right? Oregon has the lowest threshold in the country for when you die. If your estate is worth over $1 million, you're paying this tax, and that is way lower than most states. So there was a push after years and years of debate about this. Should we increase that threshold to $2.5 million? There was a bill that would have done that, but it ran into some trouble. It actually would have increased the rates that people pay when they were subject to the tax. I know this is complicated. Anyway, it ran into problems.
Above $3 million, right?
Or above
a certain threshold.
Above like $2.8 million. You would have been paying more if you died and you were relatively well off. It ran into trouble. Republicans, business groups didn't like it, and they wound up being able to kill it at the end of session. It actually looked like it might pass. It was notable just because we've had this debate so many years, and you rarely see a bill move. It moved. I think it passed through the House or the Senate.
You also rarely see it being introduced and pushed by a Democrat. I mean, usually, it's historically it's been Republicans,
right.
and it just is introduced and dies.
Yeah. Senator Anthony Broadman pushed it this time. He's a Democrat from Bend, and yeah, it passed. It passed the Senate, died in the House. Anyway, all of which is to say, economic development was a big talking point in the session. We were mentioning it a lot, and I think I would say probably a mixed record. On economic development this session.
Well, on that issue, I think one of the things that at least Democrats are claiming to be a win in this way, and it's also one of the big surprises to me this session, I know I'm not alone, was that lawmakers reached a deal to bring back the legal authority, the legal teeth of liability waivers for health, recreation, and fitness industries and businesses. To recap, these waivers, they're used by gyms and ski resorts and other businesses. They're supposed to prevent you for suing businesses for negligence, but an Oregon Supreme Court ruling back in 2014 essentially invalidated them. Industry leaders basically say that this put them at risk of frivolous lawsuits. It's pushed insurance companies out of Oregon, makes them not want to do business in the state. And all of that has caused business insurance premiums to rise. It's made it a lot harder for them to run their business, and it's potentially making it unaffordable for, Oregonians to work out and, do whatever their favorite activities are. This bill saw extensive negotiations between lawmakers, industry leaders, and lawyers around basically how to prop up this industry, keep it vibrant, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, while preserving Oregonians' rights to sue if they're injured. The bill does provide some exceptions for people to sue, but the waivers are now broadly enforceable across the state again. So that's one bill that I thought was really, really notable. Now, looking forward, we do find ourselves in election season once again. I feel like I blinked and we're already here again. What will you both be tracking now that this session is wrapped up?
Well, yeah, like you say, we go from session to election sometimes, and we're certainly going to be following the Republican primary for governor. Several of those players were involved in the legislative session. Senator Christine Drazen is a senator. She's running again against, she hopes eventually she'll be running against Democrat Tina Kotek. And then Representative Ed Deal, he's a state lawmaker who was very interestingly breaking House rules and fundraising during session. It's just sort of this long-standing policy that you're not allowed to fundraise while campaigning when you're serving in the state House. And he didn't really let that bother him, and he kept raising money. And the House Speaker, Julie Fahey, said she sent him a letter, a harshly worded letter. So,
yeah, I mean, there's some history, and he was not the only one doing it, right?
Yeah.
But like the Legislative Council said ahead of the session, actually, we think this rule that you guys have been enforcing is probably illegal. It probably runs afoul of free speech.
Probably not a good idea.
So, and Dems declined the opportunity to take it out of rules ahead of session because they thought it would be apparently a bad look if they did that in an election year. So instead, we had Deal and some other Republicans just sort of openly fundraising, and only Deal got his hand slapped, but I'm not even sure if I would call that a hand slap.
Yeah, just like a gentle nudge, like, please don't do that. That's a no thank you. I think the other thing, too, is, I'm kind of excited to see what happens with Chris Dudley in this race, the former NBA player who came close to beating John Kitzhaber in 2010 for governor. He's entered the race, and kind of eager to see if there's some momentum there at some point. We've heard that he's going to get Phil Knight money, but we've been hearing that for a long time and have not yet seen that. So certainly the GOP primary is next on the list.
Yeah, and speaking of that, like, I'll obviously be watching what happens with this gas tax vote, even though I wish I didn't have to. It still lingers on. But if the gas tax, if Democrats get their way, right, and the gas tax vote, takes place in May, I think there's a question of whether that might help Ed Deal. He was the leader of this referendum campaign to actually force these taxes to a vote. Mm-hmm. So he is really right. That's the reason he's running for governor, is because he was able to have this success and really get this grassroots army behind him. And so if it's on if it's on the May ballot when he's running against all these other Republicans, you can bet he's going to be talking about it constantly, linking himself to this vote. Mm-hmm. That could be interesting there. If it doesn't go the Dems' way and it goes to November, I think we have another very, very interesting dynamic. What we don't really know is whether this theory that having the gas tax vote on the November ballot is really going to be very, very detrimental to Democrats. I don't know what the polling would show. The thinking is that more people might show up because they want to defeat this gas tax that are then going to, just while they're there, right, probably be more friendly to a Republican candidate than they would be for Kotek. So that would be super, super interesting. Other things, we'll be watching after this. I will be tracking, it's not election related, but we should track what's happening with these MODID negotiations. The state has said it's going to recruit a guy who can, or gal who can negotiate on the state's behalf and knows how to do this and gets the state a really good deal. Yeah. And it's just not clear to me that is in the cards given the rhetoric we've seen, but we will be tracking that as well.
Okay. Lastly, we asked for listener questions about the session, and unsurprisingly, we have some pretty smart followers on social media. So let's go to some of these questions, shall we? We had a question on Blue Sky. Dirk, I think this is for you. Did Republicans seem to get their hands slapped again for their quorum shenanigans by not having their projects funded? What were the conversations around that? I think they're talking about boycotting the session twice.
Yeah, no. In the past, when what we would call walkouts or quorum denials become an issue, it's when Republicans stay away from the building for an extended period of time. They really gum up the works and don't allow things to get through. In this case, what they were I think each, the Republicans in the House and Senate did it for a day each, and not even a whole day, just in an afternoon session, if I'm remembering right. Mm-hmm. But they were characterizing these as pause. And this really is some of the only leverage they have in the building these days, and they are not shy about using it. But it's not the kind of problematic walkout, I guess, from my standpoint, that we've seen in past years. And in fact, beyond, they did not get their hands slapped. I would say they got things they wanted for this. They were coming away from session saying they secured, as I said, priorities for county fairs and a bunch of things they wanted. And they were able, Senate Republicans were explicitly able to basically gut a gun-related bill. Right. Because they threatened to walk out toward the end of session. Democrats were very explicit. We had to change that thing because they were going to walk. So they were able to use it, I would say, to some success this session.
And I was really struck by that. In the press conference, Republican leaders were touting the fact that they got that bill gutted. And just to recap, that bill was, setting up how Oregon would implement Measure 114 if the Oregon Supreme Court rules that it's constitutional. And that bill, that's the voter-approved law that passed in 2022 to ban high-capacity magazines, those with more than 10 rounds of ammunition, and also requires a permit for having a gun. So basically, a lot of the bill that would increase fees for the permit, if I remember right, and give more time for agents to issue those permits was just all removed aside. So basically, and they
pushed back the start date to 2028. So
right.
it was Republicans would say it was an unalloyed win. It was exactly gun rights folks were very, very happy with that. So the walkout worked for them.
All right. So let's go to another question. Another one is, what is the benefit of expanding city limits for people over the age of 55? Lauren, you kind of already touched on that. Do you want to add?
Yeah, I think, like I said, that population is growing. I think in Oregon, especially, we're expecting what they're calling a silver tsunami, which is the number of people older than 65 is the percentage is expected to just keep rapidly increasing. And at the same time, this population, they have sometimes some extra issues that you have to think
Needs,
about,
right.
health issues, cognitive decline, mobility issues that can make finding affordable housing extra hard. Plus, also, I think the idea here was let's make it more affordable. Like sometimes it's very difficult to pencil out the building of a manufactured home park or housing just for 55 and older. So allowing them to bypass the land use laws, find cheaper land, it might make it more as an incentive for a developer who might want to build housing for this population.
Got it. And Lauren, one more question for you regarding prohibiting ICE agents from wearing masks. The question is wondering who is going to enforce this, given that police are, quote, just as bad.
Well, I mean, I think we also touch on that again is like, we're going to see this play out in the court probably, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then it will be up to the federal judges to decide whether ICE agents are allowed to conceal their identities or not. And even then, will the administration agree to what the judges decide? I mean, I think we've seen that they're willing to just kind of go with what they think is best. And I also, one thing I don't think that we have touched on is the reason why ICE agents are saying that they should be able to conceal their identity is, their stance on it is that otherwise they get doxxed quite quickly from online and people go after their family members. So that's their perspective on that. But this is going to play out in the courts and then it's anybody's guess.
Right. Dirk, I am curious about your thoughts about this last question, actually. It's more of a comment, but this commenter is saying the adjustments to the campaign finance system they're saying it's, quote, a farce. And they are wondering if the Democrats may well regret passing this law in the long run. And they're pointing out that unions support the delayed implementation of it. What do you think of this?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question or comment, but look, I mean, this is such a tough subject, right? Because one, as you laid out, like there were some issues with the bills they passed 2 years ago. Something had to be done. The big debate was whether or not the things they did were just gifts to the unions and the business groups that are going to sort of let business continue as usual. There was a national expert at the Campaign Legal Center that says, yeah, these are big holes you're blowing into this thing.
Yeah.
Here's the step back from campaign finance that is really like where I always come down. Because of Citizens United, right? Like any campaign contribution limit that we can put into place is ultimately going to be quite easily gotten around because groups can form their own super PACs or whatever, their own PACs that are just buying ads disconnected from any candidate and can spend unlimited amounts of money, right? And you see this in congressional politics all the time where a congressional candidate will have a specific page on their website that is like, here's some stock footage of me, here's some talking points I think my voters would benefit from hearing, and the super PACs just pull that straight up, do their own ads. We are moving toward a situation like that in Oregon. So that was acknowledged in some of this debate. When this goes into effect, it's just a fact that the groups, it's very likely that the groups that folks are pointing to, unions, business groups, are going to move to that model. Now, I can't predict and I'll just be honest, I haven't looked very, very in depth at the new statutes they put into place. I've listened to some of the arguments. It's possible they work within the framework that was passed this session, but I think by and large, what's expected is more of a congressional model because folks will move to the path of least resistance. And in a scenario where there's high contribution limits, that moves to the independent expenditure side. I have no idea if I answered or spoke to this reader's comments.
But we're following you. Okay. Dirk and Lauren, what a session it was. Thank you so much for your reporting on it. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for your partnership, Bryce.
Yes. Thank you, Bryce.
This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded live in the Gert Boyle studio. It was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Naleen Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.